Law Enforcement Forum, bail reform in New York City, a very important issue being covered today here at City College by Sergeant Johnny Nunez, the founder of the Global Alliance of Hispanic Law Enforcement Professionals. Let's take a look.
And we really appreciate what La Perute, Tony, has done, so I'd like you to begin with a few words. Thank you.
My name is Lieutenant Anthony Lapper. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Safety at City College. This is a very important topic. I'm glad everybody's here, and looking forward to learning some interesting things regarding the bail reform in New York. So I'd like to introduce, again, the President of Gallup, Sergeant Johnny Nunez.
Thank you so much, Tony, for this venue. Wonderful place. Very happy to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is our first event of 2020, and on behalf of our organization, we want to thank you all for attending and wishing all of us a very prosperous, peaceful, healthy, but most importantly, safe New Year for everybody. So in this forum, we're going to take a closer look at what exactly this new package, this reform package that became effective on the 1st of this year, what does it contain? As you probably heard, there are good purposes. Some of the purposes behind the bail reform, at least the proponents argue, are number one, to provide more fairness into the criminal justice system. Number two, to prevent poor people from languishing in jail for low-level crimes while their cases are pending and working through the system. They add that this approach will also combat overcrowding jails and reduce the jail population in our state and city. Now, on the other hand, the consensus in law enforcement seems to be that this bail reform package will also have unintended consequences that perhaps were not taken into consideration before making the law effective. Opponents argue that the laws were hastily enacted without discussion or input from the criminal justice professionals. How about the crime victims, advocates?
Chief De La Rosa, what a great forum. We're hearing things about bail reform that none of us really knew about. It's really spectacular that this is being discussed with such law enforcement scholars like yourself.
Thank you.
Bail reform, sir, in a gist. What is it all about? Everyone's talking about it.
It is about a reform, about no bails, and about 400 crimes that were instituted at the beginning of the year. And this reform is affecting all the phases of the criminal justice system, including the operation of the police officers, the correction officers, the probation officers, the courts, the ADAs, and the way that they handle the no bails crimes. The person is arrested, and if he qualifies for pre-trial no bails, he's released with a DAT where he has to come back another day to see the judge.
Chief, what assurances does the community have that these individuals, these defendants, will return for the court date?
Well, usually it's the case that if the individual is given a court date and he doesn't return, a warrant will be issued on that individual's name, and he will have to return.
Are New Yorkers safer with this bail reform?
We're still too short to analyze the whole thing. I'm sure there is a little bit tweak, that some fixing that we'll have to do. I'm sure Albany is looking into the daily operation of the outcome of this at the police departments, the courts, and everything. I'm sure that there will be a time and will be good if all of them get together, all the stakeholders get together and put the package together.
Well, sir, thank you for your service, all the great work you've done. You've retired after how many years?
38 years on the job.
So
38 years as a police from police officer to deputy chief.
Outstanding. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you for keeping us all safe. Let's
Thank
listen
you.
to his testimony.
There goes my time from 15 to probably 7 minutes. But no, I will definitely I will be covering the points from the police department view, and you have to understand that I am no longer with the police department, so I could probably be more open the way I see things. I will talk like a commanding officer. I will talk like the person that grew up in the South Bronx and saw in the 70s and 80s and saw the deterioration and the crime that were at that time. And I could see we moving to that way if we continue this path that we're following. So we see that effective January this year, New York State has passed a series of reforms intended to promote fairness and due process throughout the criminal justice system. The bail reform law eliminate money bail for pretrial and for nearly all misdemeanor and non-violent felonies defendants. To me, it appears that some of the legislators or elected officials use politics to introduce legislation that will affect public safety without first consulting all criminal justice system shareholders. First, it is the reform of the jail population to reduce the jail population. And then it's the introduction this year for no bail reforms for more than, he mentioned about 400 minor crimes. This reform will affect those shareholders that I mentioned before that were not included in the original decision planning, what I will call the other elements of the criminal justice system. It will definitely affect the daily operation of the police officers, correction officers, probation officers, ADAs, judges, but most importantly, it will affect the operation or the quality of life of the community. It will affect and impact public safety. Johnny mentioned the key findings that we had before. Looking at April 1st of 2019, approximately 5,000 people were detained. Of those 5,000, 43% will have been released with this new law. And again, last year, 205,000 criminal cases were arraigned in New York City. Of those, 10% only will qualify for the bail money. The rest will have been released under this new law.
A law enforcement scholar, someone that I've followed for a long time, NYPD, now you're at St. John's. You've done so much. First of all, thank you for your service, sir.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Dr. Robert Gonzalez, what do you think should have been done different before passing this bail reform law?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. As we look at the legislation and we look at the current predicament that we're in now here in New York State, I think what failed, to happen as this particular process was being involved was they didn't invite the stakeholders. They didn't invite the police chiefs, the district attorneys from the different boroughs, the district attorneys from the outer boroughs in New York State, the police professionals, the academics, community activists. They failed to bring these people in and get a complete, perspective on how the legislation would not only impact community, but how it would impact the logistics and a lot of these agencies that are now scrambling to abide by some of the rules and regulations with the legislation. So I think there was a gap there. They rushed to get this legislation voted on and approved in April, and then now we're dealing with the backlash within the last 31 days since January 1st of all of the the changes that are implemented and some of these heartbreaking stories that we're hearing in the press. But I think overall, I think there was just a disconnect between the people writing the legislation and those that it was going to really impact in the industry.
In your professional opinion, Professor, repeal, retweak, what's best?
I think retweak. We have to remember how we got here. We got here because there were incidences that we've heard about of individuals who were forgotten about in the system that spend a prolonged period of time in the jails waiting for their day in court. So we have to remember how we got here, and I think there is some legitimacy to how we got here and needing to have some sort of legislation. But I think if they would have included, the stakeholders in the criminal justice system, we would have had a better piece of legislation that would have been more reasonable on both sides, right? More of the equal scales of justice, but it seems like the scales are slanted now as a result of this legislation. And it's slanted, unfortunately, on the side of the perpetrators and those inside the system now.
Absolutely. We heard some of your testimony. We're going to air some of your testimony. You're at St. John's now. Great school. I have a lot of friends that graduated from there. And how can we get in touch with you? What's the best way? Because you have so much to say.
Well, I do have a lot on my plate, but I'm still, available. I try to be available, to different outlets. I have over almost nearly 30 years in the industry of criminal justice. I started very young as a student of criminal justice, and then also as a police officer, for nearly 25 years. And then now I've kind of parked in, academia, where I've taken my practical experience and now brought into the classroom. But I can be reached at St. John's University. My email is gonzalr1@stjohns.edu. I look forward to conversing with anybody on the topic. Again, not just students, but anyone who has an interest, in what's happening, because I'm a resident of New York City. I live in the Bronx, so this new legislation impacts me as a resident, but also as a practitioner.
Well, Professor, Doctor, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on all your good deeds. Antonio J. Cruz, tell us a little bit about yourself, sir.
So I'm a retired lieutenant from the NYPD. I was a lieutenant and a sergeant in the NYPD Gang Division. I also had a brief career in the Department of Correction, where I was an acting deputy commissioner and a deputy director. And currently I'm an academic. I'm actually an adjunct professor at St. John's University, and I'm teaching correctional administration and criminal justice.
Go St. John's. I have a lot of friends that graduated.
Go
Good school.
Go Johnnies.
Go Johnnies. There you go. A question about bail reform. You made an excellent presentation. We're going to share it with our public. Should there have been more involvement from the community and from practitioners like yourself before making bail reform a law?
Absolutely, Carl, because what happens is now this bail reform came into effect, and it impacts law enforcement and the community, but those folks did not have a part in drafting this legislation. So what happens is, like anything else, things sometimes need to be addressed and changed, but there's got to be input from the different stakeholders that it's going to affect, especially the police department and members of the community, because it affects them on a daily basis. So this thing should have been, there should have been more input from the practitioners, the police side, corrections, district attorneys, and from the people in the community, definitely.
Professor, without getting into the politics, do you think that there should be a discussion to repeal this bail reform in Albany?
There should be a discussion to modify this. Not necessarily repeal it, because there is a reason why the bail reform was made, but there definitely should be some discussions on modifying this, because it definitely has an impact on law enforcement operations.
We're joined here by another panelist, law enforcement scholar, professional. Many may know him. You will know him after today. Gentleman's name is Itty Giddy. Tell us a little bit about your background, sir.
A little bit about myself. Grew up in the South Bronx. Parents are from the Bay Islands, on Roatan in Honduras. And I lived in the South Bronx pretty much all my life. And not only did I grow up in the South Bronx, but I attended the school in South Bronx, and I ended up following my career through going through college and going to work in the law enforcement field.
I took a couple of courses with you in the past. Amazing. You're an amazing facilitator. We look forward to your testimony here today. We're going to share your testimony here today. Are we safer, Eddie? Are we safer? Is the community safer with this bail reform?
To be honest with you, we're not safe with the bail reform right now, because the bail reform is needed. but it needs to be rewritten. It needs to be adjusted. The bail reform is needed to keep people out of jail that have been in jail for a long period of time. But it also needs to be rewritten because we have to keep law-abiding citizens safe. You can't just have people committing crime and next few hours they're released on the street and they're back on the street committing crime either to the next person or either terrorizing the person they just committed a crime to. So the bail reform actually affects everybody and it needs to be adjusted.
Do you believe that when they retweak it, that they should bring in the public and bring in law enforcement scholars like yourself to make it better, if you will?
Yes, you need the community, you need the law enforcement, you need everybody. Everybody plays a major role in the bail reform because we need also additional funding because when we release, when the criminals commit their crimes and they're released back into society, where are they going? How are we keeping them busy? So everybody plays a role in it, and we need everybody help so we can actually make the bail reform better.
Outstanding. Sir, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. Let's listen to his testimony. Bail reform.
An academic and a former police officer. So again, I apologize to the people here if I offend anyone, but I think we have to go back and we have to remember where all this came from, how we got to this place, on why there needed to be bail reform. So contrary to what my personal beliefs might be, I guess my academic belief is that we kind of have to reinforce the points on how we got to this particular place. One point I want to emphasize for people maybe in the room or who may watch the video or just kind of being, consumed with this in the press is there is a difference between jail and prison, right? And we have to remind ourselves that this legislation came about pre-trial. And what that means for people who may not understand, it means before a person actually goes to trial, they're being incarcerated and they're being held up until that point, right? And I think as a community, and again, even as a quasi-sociologist, right, we have an obligation to remember that an individual has a presumption of innocence, right? So there's a presumption of innocence prior, to going to trial, right? And oftentimes, financially, individuals are being incarcerated and they're being held in prison, whether they're innocent or guilty, that precludes them from spending time with their families, precludes them from working so that they can, raise money to not only support their family, but hire an adequate defense, right? So this is why we got here, right? So we got here because there were numerous cases, right? And again, my fellow colleague here spent some time in working in the jail system knows that there are individuals like Khalif Brower who were forgotten about, throughout the process, throughout the system, whether guilty or innocent. He spent almost 2 years, in Rikers Island pre-trial, right, before he even had his trial date or before a decision was even made about his case, right? So that's what really brought us to where we are. That's what brings, the legislation. That's why everybody's in an uproar, about the legislation, right? So again, we have to remember, right, we might, and again, not at the expense of public safety, obviously, right? We want, people who are violent and people who are committing these violent crimes to stay incarcerated, right, until they have their day in court.
CUNY Public Safety, Chief Pat Morena, Anthony Laparuta, Lieutenant, who came on his own time, and Specialist Rochester, who this morning helped us set up. So thank you very much for facilitating this, because you guys are always great. You're open to the community, and we thank you very much. So I also want to thank my fellow panelists who have a wealth of knowledge and experience. Chief Manny De La Rosa, who was in the NYPD for 38 years, came from Cuba. It's an American success story. Dr. Rob Gonzalez, who's the highest ranking criminal justice person on faculty at St. John's University. So we're fortunate to have such great individuals with great experience and talent to join us today. So for me, this is a very important discussion. As an academic, because I am a criminal justice professor, a practitioner. I was both a sergeant and a lieutenant in the NYPD gang division, and I was also a deputy director and acting deputy commissioner at the New York City Department of Correction. So I've had a kind of really interesting career and kind of a unique perspective because I've been in jail and been outside jail, So it's kind of like, very, very unique perspective. So I consider myself a realist, right? And I'm not a fear monger, because now, if you read in the paper recently, people that have been opposed to the bail reform or have spoken up have been, labeled as fear mongers. And you know what? Sometimes you got to be realistic. You got to be a realistic person, right? Because not everything's to the left, not everything's to the right. Sometimes it's a little to the middle, it's a little to the right, and that's where you got to go.
It's an honor to be sitting among Chief De La Rosa, Dr. Gonzalez, and again, Professor Cruz, who are, to me, are people that I look up to as mentors. So it's an honor and a pleasure to sit here with you gentlemen. One of the biggest effects that's going on in the communities, and this is why it's a pleasure to be here, due to the bail reform that's occurring. Bail reform is needed. People shouldn't be sitting in jails for a long period of time. But the problem that's occurring right now is the crime that's occurring upon being released from the bail reform. People are being released back into the communities, but now when the bail reform was created, they forgot to have the professionals from law enforcement, educators, and several other community sitting on this decision. So now we have people that are being released after committing crime, and they're continuing to commit the crime. How many crimes are we going to continue to allow them to commit in the community before we say this is enough? Innocent people, law-abiding citizens are being affected by the actual crimes that are being committed, and that's where it's coming into play. The bail reform needs to be rewritten. It needs to be adjusted. I'm going to touch on gangs. Professor Cruz, Chief De La Rosa, and Dr. Gonzalez mentioned about the activities and crime that's occurring throughout the community. Gangs are no secret to no community. Gangs been around since 1820s, and we're sitting here right now, 2020, and we still having these issues going on. I read an article just yesterday by Daniel Horowitz from the Conservative Review, where he stated he received stats from NYPD stating that shooting is up in the community, 59.6.
Well, you know what, first of all, always thank you for covering the event. The highlight for me, I think, was, again, the purpose was to have a dialogue, free of political passions, emotions, and I think it was fantastic, having the different perspectives from the chief, the executive, Dr. Gonzalez, who gave us pretty much a historical, how did we get here? The history of bail reform, how did this come about, which is important. It's important to highlight the positive, the intention, the good intention, but of course, when we get into specifics, Tony was unbelievable as well. I mean, all the different perspectives. Giddy from corrections, gangs. In other words, maybe not repeal this, but it has consequences. And perhaps it needs to be tweaked. It's tweaked. And an interesting thing from the audience is that, although we wanted to leave politics out of it, but necessarily, the politicians are the ones that advocated for this, that put this together, and I think the consensus was perhaps they should have consulted with the criminal justice professionals, with the advocates for victims, and a fantastic event. I mean, I'm very, very satisfied. I think that this is something that we should do more often. But I think the consensus was that, the community, how do you bridge that gap? And I think, and it has to do with bringing the community, the information, social media, there's a lack of information. And I always say, information is key, knowledge of the law, the hesitancy of police officers, and the current environment. And the focus was, this is upon us. Let's just objectively tell the officers, what should we do? How do you handle different situations? And you saw from the video case analysis that we show how you saw the different perspectives come into play. But Pedro, as a community member, I don't know what you think.
Absolutely, Clark. It's always great to see you, and I think we will all agree that these type of events also help us come up with new ideas. And I sincerely believe that, at least I am actually very interested in doing a little more homework, doing a little more research as to how can we work with the community team that's already assigned, funding from the state already available for us to actually go out there and deliver this type of information to the community. And again, the more we participate in these type of events, the more education you're going to deliver to the actual community that needs it very well.
Yeah, Pedro and Sarge, you guys are out here. You guys are doing great work. It's a not-for-profit organization. How can people reach out to you guys so you guys can continue to do the great work that you're doing?
Yes, we share everything on social media, Twitter. I thank you a lot for always sharing. But we're welcome. We invite the community to reach out to us. We have a website, gallup.org. An interesting thing. Speaking about community, we had a few activists in the room, but again, a different perspective. We have the chaplains, church people. It was interesting their take on what's happening, and they're not happy. They're not happy with the local legislation. But one of the, particularly Maria, she gave a perspective that, it took me by surprise because what she was saying was, even though we didn't want to politicize it, and it was not, but she says, how about law enforcement? You guys, the chief, 38 years on the job, maybe you should aspire for a political position. And it made me think, why not? I mean, actually, we have two active former law enforcement members that are running for Congress, Lieutenant Ravello. We have Anthony Miranda, and the idea is, yes, maybe we should consider, maybe hopefully a Gallup member would decide to, So I wasn't thinking that at an angle because I think that is important. Politicians are making the law, so why not? Why not offer a different voice? So that's some of the highlights that for me I walk away with, again, with different perspectives, and hopefully we'll replicate this. It was fascinating. I mean, again, listening to the different perspectives. Tony, thank you. And I hope that we can do it again.
Well, great success, Sergeant. Pedro, before we go, website, if anyone wants to make any donations to this wonderful organization.
Absolutely. I think we definitely would agree that when it comes to a nonprofit organization, it's very important for us to do these type of events so that we can also collect funding that allow us to continue impacting the community. So gallup.org, it's our official website. You're more than welcome to donate. It could be $1. It could be whatever amount that you desire. At this point, we also have on-site activities that would basically trigger us to take advantage of the actual moment that we have in front of us to generate income for the organization so that we can continue these activities.
And more importantly, get involved. Come to our events, suggest an events. It's all free of charge. Invite us to the communities.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thanks again. You guys have beautiful coins, beautiful lapel pins, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you.
I purchased both. I'll buy some more.
Thank you.
And thank you, gentlemen, for doing what you do.